I do want to spend a little more time talking about the middle passage. Image up behind me of an African watching as the ships are coming toward the continent of Africa. There are a couple of things I do want to bring out. I want to continue to hit the point that I've been making in the previous weeks, that African people did not simply accept their fate. Much like I'd mentioned early on in the first lesson, that African people were not simply waiting on the rest of the world for history to happen. When history began to happen to them in a negative way, they did not simply wait or accept their fate in what they were dealing with or encountering at that time. So I want to make that point. I want to continue to make that point. Allow me to pause here for just a second, because that's something I need to pin this image so that we don't end up with changes in the image. My bad, I forgot to do that. Unfortunately, this is all going to show up on the live video, but we will do what we need to do to make this work. And then I need to zoom in just a tad, which means you all won't see that image as much, but we'll go with it. So again, Africans did not simply accept their fate. They did not simply accept their fate, but they fought and they fought and they fought. And so I'm going to spend much of today's lesson talking about the fights that took place, because I want us to see, even in the midst of the tryingness of times, African people did not simply accept their fate. The fight against slavery, if I could say it this way, the fight against slavery started on the continent of Africa. The fight against slavery started on the continent of Africa. That fight continued on ships, and it continued once they arrived in what we knew at that time as the New World. So there's always been a fight. There's always been a struggle against slavery, and that struggle has always been led by African people, and then later on by African American people. And so I want to hit this point. There's probably going to be some nuances and details that many of you will be hearing for the first time, and that's really the purpose of this class. It's really the reason why I'm doing it. I'm quite honestly, to be honest with you, to put it all up front, I'm looking for the things that we haven't been taught. Because when you're teaching any wide subject like this, you've got to make choices about how it's taught, because you can't talk about everything. That's the case with any subject. You can't talk about everything. So you literally have to decide what you're talking about. And when you decide what you're talking about, you're also making a decision about what you're not talking about. And so there are a lot of things about our history, or any history for that matter. When you choose the themes that you are teaching, it means other themes are not being taught. There's nothing bad about it. It's just the reality that if you're taking any course, let's say, for example, at the college level, at any level for that matter, you have a finite amount of time in which you have to present all the material that you can. And as a result, there are a lot of things that you just will not be able to cover. The other side to that, though, is when you're making decisions about what you're going to cover, I would argue that you cover the most consequential things. And so I'm spending a lot of time as we go through these classes, and I will be intentionally looking for things that don't quite fit the narrative that we've been taught as we are learning. That's why on last week, we talk about the middle passage, but we rarely talk about sharks following ships. That's why I brought it up, because for something to go on for as long as it did, for the transatlantic slave trade to go on for as long as it did, what did it do to sharks or other animals like that in the waters as they begin to learn the patterns of what was taking place going across the Atlantic Ocean? And so they begin to follow those ships, as I mentioned on last week, because they knew at some point during the voyage, bodies would come over. And so it is the reality of what took place, documented by individuals who were on those ships in the 17 and 1800s and witnessed those things happening. But I want to talk about some other things that have been documented on many of these ships. Some slave revolts on ships that were successful and others that were unsuccessful. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both. I want to read something. I got 2 books I'm going to be referring to today. I want to let you know 2 of them that I've been using already. One, I told you the principal book that we'll be using is John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. And I'll go back and refer to Vincent Harding's There Is a River. Those are the 2 primary, they're not primary sources, but those are the 2 sources that I will be referencing throughout much of this study. Over to my left, there are a couple other books, probably won't reference as much this week, is John Blassingame's The Slave Community and Robin Kelly and Earl Lewis's A History of African Americans to 1800. I will be referencing those as we move along in these courses. I won't reference them much today, but I always want to tell you the sources because my goal is not only to give you information, but to give you the means by which you can get and glean information for yourselves as well. John O. Franklin, when he talks about the Middle Passage, he calls it a one-way passage. It says the voyage to the Americas, popularly referred to as the Middle Passage, was a veritable nightmare. Overcrowding was most common. There were records of ships as small as 90 tons carrying a complement of 390 slaves, in addition to the crew and provisions. The practice of overcrowding slaves became so common that the British Parliament felt compelled to specify that not more than 5 slaves could be carried for every 3 tons of the burden of a ship of 200 tons. This regulation, like so many others, was not enforced. More slaves meant more profits. And few traders could resist the temptation to wedge in a few more. There was hardly standing, lying, or sitting room. Chained together by tools, hands, and feet, slaves had no room in which to move about and no freedom to exercise their bodies, even to the slightest. It was doubtless the crowded conditions on the vessels that so greatly increased the incidence of disease and epidemics during the voyage to America. Smallpox was one of the dreaded diseases of the period, and one experienced observer remarked that few ships that carried slaves escaped without it. Perhaps even more deadly than smallpox was flux, a frequently fatal malady from which whites on board the slave ships were apparently spared. Hunger strikes at times aggravated unfavorable health conditions and induced illnesses where previously there had been none. The filth and the stench caused by close quarters and disease brought on more illness, and the mortality rate increased accordingly. Perhaps not more than half the slaves shipped from Africa ever became effective workers in the New World. Let me say that again. Perhaps not more than half the slaves shipped from Africa ever became effective workers in the New World, because many of those that did not die of disease or commit suicide by jumping overboard were permanently disabled by the ravages of some dread disease or by maiming, which often resulted from struggling against the chains. Small wonder that one trader who arrived at Barbados with 372 of his original 700 slaves was moved to remark, "No gold finders can endure so much noisome slavery as they do who carry Negroes. For those have some respite and satisfaction, but we endure twice the misery, and yet by the mortality our voyages are ruined, and we pine and fret ourselves to death to think that we should undergo so much misery and take so much pains to so little purpose." I would argue that they would continue to undergo so much misery and take so much pain. They say for so little purpose, but in this particular case, this individual started out with 700 slaves when they left the continent of Africa and arrived in Barbados with 372. That means on that voyage, they lost 328 of their 700 slaves on the passage from Africa to America. And what John O. Franklin is saying in this small piece is that that was normal operations for slave trafficking at that time. That the conditions that these slaves were in were horrible conditions in the Middle Passage. But I would challenge us to, as I said on last week, that if our ancestors can endure it, then we can face it. If our ancestors can endure it, then we can face it. And so they didn't take these conditions lying down. They didn't simply accept their fate once they were captured and moved from the inner, many times from the inner portions of the continent to the shores where many fights and struggles started and many lives were also lost. And so when we talk about 10 to 12 million slaves that moved from the continent of Africa to the Americas, that does not count the numbers, the scores of individuals who never made it to the shore. And so when I mentioned on last week, I want to mention it again today, that while we spend a lot of time talking about the impacts of slavery in America, I will challenge you to also think about the impacts of this Middle Passage on Africa and this depopulation of West Africa that is taking place, primarily West Africa, not only West Africa, because there are other areas that's not in the Americas where slaves are also being moved to. We talked about some of those. We talked about Europe, we talked about Britain, and we talked about Spain and those other areas in Europe. But there's an internal slave trade that is happening, that there are slaves moving from the West Coast into the eastern parts of the continent and other parts of the world as well. Much smaller numbers, much smaller numbers. I just want to bring it up because it's there, but in much smaller numbers than the numbers that we're talking about that are moving from the western part of the continent of Africa to the Americas. But I want you to think about this depopulation that is taking place, and not only think about the impacts that it's having on America or the New World at that time. I try to say that intentionally because it's not America yet. But think also about what's happening to the continent of Africa, and particularly in these countries where thousands upon thousands of people are being stripped from their homelands and shipped across the Atlantic for the purposes of slavery. And so as this process would continue, it would continue to weaken the continent, on the western part of the continent. And while many Africans would not allow white traders into the interior of the continent, later on in the slave trade, they get just that. They are able to then push their way into the interior as the continent, particularly the western parts of the continent, are becoming weaker by this constant depopulation that is taking place. But the struggle continued because, as I mentioned, African people did not simply accept their fate. I'm a firm believer that Africans in this period did not see themselves as slaves. And the reason why I say that is because if they had accepted their fate, there would be no need for chains. If they had accepted their fate, then they would have willingly gone, and they would not, as John O. Franklin mentioned, have to be chained together 2 by 2 so that they could not revolt, so that they could not fight, so that they could not find ways to make it back to their homelands. They were shackled and physically enslaved because they were mentally free. I'm going to say that again, that they were physically shackled because they were mentally free. That you can remove shackles once you have enslaved the mind. And when you look at the history of slavery and the slave trade and slave traffic, what you will find is throughout the entire period, people fought. And they fought because they did not accept their fate. That while there were those who felt the sheer weight of what was going on, as John O. Franklin said, as I'll read this first sentence in that piece, the one-way passage, he said, the voyage to the Americas, popularly referred to as the Middle Passage, was a veritable nightmare. And so while many people would fight and struggle, there are those who would buckle under the conditions that they're in, would feel that there was no way out. There were others who would say in their minds, if I could imagine this, much like songs that were sung later in slavery, that before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. And so they fought. And so Vincent Harding, in his chapter From the Shores of Africa, begins to talk about the struggles that were taking place on the continent. And he says, if chains and guns were necessary when Africans were stuffed down in the brutal darkness between the decks, then even greater force and threat of force were often deemed necessary when they came up on deck to eat. The captain continues, quote, they are fed twice a day, at 10 in the morning and 4 in the evening, which is the time they are aptest to mutiny. Being all upon deck, therefore all that time, what of our men are not employed in distributing their victuals to them and settling them, stand to their arms, and some with lighted matches at the great guns that yawn upon them, loading with partridge, till they have done and gone down to their kennels between decks. Such testimony from the men who manned the ships of black captivity was repeated hundreds of times throughout the centuries of the table. In spite of their names, many of the vessels were indeed meant to be kennels, the same kennel, same term used for where you would house a dog, kennels where human beings were forced to exist for weeks and months in conditions not fit for animals. That is why so many hundreds of thousands of our ancestors were ravaged by disease, lying for days in their own excrement, dying in these cattle ships. Yet the ships were also prisons for humans. That was the meaning of the chains, the guns, and the fearful white men standing with lighted matches at the cannon. For ultimately they knew that we were more than animals, that the secret conversations of the barracoons and lower decks could turn into rebellion at any moment. So as in all prisons, an inordinate amount of the captor's time was spent in simply watching and guarding against any Black movement toward freedom. And the life of the sailor guards locked in a captivity parallel with our own was often filled with sheer wretchedness. I like the way Vincent Hardin talks about this, because same as it is then as now, in order to enslave someone, you must also enslave yourself. And so the conditions that the slaves were under, while they were absolutely worse than the conditions that their white captors had to deal with, to enslave them, however, meant they were also enslaved. And they were living in the same fears, yet for different reasons. And while African people were fearful of where they were going and what they were, the conditions upon which they were now thrust upon them, and where they were going and what they were going into, those white captors were also afraid, because they knew at any moment their very lives could be the cost of the decisions that they made to work that process of transporting African bodies across the Atlantic. He says, in the course of those struggles, it developed that the ships were even more than prisons. Ultimately, they provided Black people with an introduction to the Euro-American state, for they were many states with their own polity, their own laws and government. The common sailors were the ship's own indigenous oppressed class. The individuals who were sailing the ships and working the ships were the indigenous oppressed class of white people. And when the Africans were brought on board, much of the machinery of these floating miniatures of England and France, of Virginia and Massachusetts, could be geared toward our captivity. But the internal contradiction did not disappear. At the core of the many states, prisons, and kennels, it was also possible to discover the social, economic, and political scourges rising out of Europe: racism, capitalism, and the deep human fears they engender. The tie of the ships to European capitalism was evident in the decision to call them slavers, and in their relationship to the slave factories and the industrial factories at home, which made the goods that they brought to trade for humans. To maximize profits, the ships had to herd as many Africans aboard as possible and to exploit their own white crews. And so I want to bring this up because when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, what we generally talk about is what's happening to African people. But what's also happening is what's also being brought out, though, and what Vincent Hardin is trying to bring out in this piece, is that there are also other things that are being impacted with the social dynamics in the countries from which these people are coming from. That these aren't the people, the slavers, if you will, are those who are doing the transport of slaves across the Atlantic, aren't the ones who are benefiting the most financially from the traffic itself. There are other people, there are other corporations, the individuals who are making the mass of all the money from this aren't the folk on the ship. They are the people who are investing in those companies and the companies themselves and the owners of those companies. And I'm going to get into some of that. I want to bring some documents in before I begin to speak about some of those things, because when I bring this part out, there are things that I'll have to make sure that I contextualize the right way. But you'll be amazed. Some will be amazed, and maybe you won't be amazed when we talk about who and what entities and what organizations are behind the financing of ships that are engaging in the traffic of persons. We'll get into that a little bit later. But the challenges on the ships, because as I said before, Africans did not simply accept their fate. And so I want to talk a little bit about some things that took place on the ships. Vincent Harding would talk about this. He says, it was unmistakable in the words and intent of William Snellgrave, one of the more famous, because he was more literary, slaving captain. So that means he was one of those who wrote more about what was taking place. He was one of the more literary slaving captains. In 1721, he reported on the execution of an African who had killed a white man in the struggle for freedom. Snellgrave had the black man hoisted as high as possible above the deck, watch this, and shot to death in the presence of his fellow Africans. Then he said, I ordered the linguist to acquaint the men Negroes that now they might judge no one that killed a white man should be spared. Snellgrave probably did not know it then, but even if he had hoisted the insurrectionary up into the clouds, the struggle would not have ended. Though few of their words survive, the actions of our fathers and mothers in those ships along the coast declared that many of them were determined to carry on a relentless struggle for freedom. They wanted freedom from the status of animals, the role of prisoners, the domination of white Europeans. They wanted to continue in their people's long stream of history. Snellgrave talked about it. There's a chapter in one of the other books I'm going to talk about later when I deal with this in slavery. So I want you to write this term down because it'll come back. Write the term down if you're taking notes: blackhead signpost. Blackhead signpost. And what Snellgrave was doing by hoisting this man up as high as he could and shooting him and killing him in front of all of the black men who were on that ship being transported across the Atlantic, he was making an example, of course, out of the one who had killed a white man. And he wanted to make sure that all of them knew that that same fate would be theirs if they tried to do what he did. And as Vincent Harding said, he could have hoisted that man into the clouds and it would not have mattered, because that struggle would have continued. No matter how many times African people saw other African people killed for attempting to fight, they kept fighting. So I wasn't going to mention it, but I will mention it. So when you have individuals who are saying that, considering how long slavery took place in America, that at this point, when we look back, slavery was a choice. It was not a choice. I'll put it this way. It was a choice, but it was a choice that our ancestors did not accept. There are people who will say failure is not an option. Failure is always an option. It's just not a good one. Slavery is a choice, but it's not a good one. And our ancestors kept fighting. They kept fighting. They kept struggling. They kept pushing. They kept looking for ways to make their situations better. It says our ancestors, though their words did not survive, their actions absolutely did. It says in the early struggles on the ships in the coastal waters, the African captives used every available tool to strike for freedom. Sometimes they even broke their own chains and transformed them into weapons. It says near the end of the 17th century, off the shores of the Gulf of Guinea, where the Castle of Elmina stood, a Dutch captain underestimated the power of the will of his black captives. He fished up an anchor left behind by another ship and put it down in the hold where the male Africans were being held. And the anchor became a signal and a forge. Listen to what this Dutch writer says. His name is William Bosman. He says, the men, unknown to any of the ship's crew, possessed themselves of a hammer with which in a short time they broke all of their fetters or chains in pieces upon the anchor. After this, they came above deck and fell upon our men, some of whom they grievously wounded, and would certainly have mastered the ship if a French and English ship had not fortunately happened to lie by us and immediately came to our assistance with shallops and men, and drove the slaves under deck, notwithstanding which before all was appeased, about 20 of them were killed. The lessons then being written in the red and coastal water soon entered into the long history of the struggle. Blacks have never lacked the ingenuity, wisdom, courage, and a deep longing for freedom. But in captivity, these were not sufficient. It was not enough to break the chains. It was necessary to master the ship. It was not enough to break the chains. It was necessary to master the ship. And let me say this to you. There were times when African people who fought on these ships, they got to a place where they were mastering the ships, and some of them sailed those ships back home. Along the African coast, it was possible to hope for such mastery. So in spite of constant and costly defeats, the struggles for freedom went on. And then he talks about the role of women in the struggle, because they focused a lot on the men because, of course, the men were stronger. But many times they would allow women to be more free when they're moving about the ships. And that would come up sometimes to bite them as well. They wanted, the reason why they would bring people up, because in order to have a healthy slave on the other side of the Atlantic, they could not leave them in the holds of the ships chained together for a 90-day voyage or longer. They would all die from, laying in their excrement and all of the sickness and disease. They would kill them all. So they would have to bring them up to feed them or bring them up to give them exercise. A lot of times they would bring the women up with the children to let them run around, and the women would be up there to care for those children. Many times they would bring the women up so that they could, as some would say, ravish their lust upon them as well. But women, a lot of African women, would allow the freedoms that they had to be lookouts as they were looking for the best opportunities to revolt. And so Vincent Harding talks about that. Fortunately, he says, many of the women didn't just simply accept the fact that they had more freedoms as a privilege, but they would use those freedoms that they would have on those ships to be lookouts or to look out for opportunities where it was more feasibly successful if they could overtake a ship. It says in the early struggles in those ships, my page changed. I went to the wrong spot. It says, even without the faces or the names, what begins to be clear is the stunning, perhaps frightening power resident in these early struggles. For instance, we know only that in 1730, the captive Africans of the Massachusetts schooner William conspired together and killed almost all the crew, then made their way back to the nearby shores. That in this particular case on this ship William from Massachusetts, African people killed almost every slaver on the ship and sailed the ship back to Africa. On another Massachusetts ship of the same period, the Negroes got to the powder and arms, and about 3 o'clock in the morning rose upon the whites, and after wounding all of them very much, except 2 who hit themselves, the blacks ran the vessel ashore a little to the southward of Cape Lopez and made their escape. So too, near the end of 1732, a contemporary account reported that a group of captives from Guinea on board a Bristol slaving ship rose up and destroyed the whole crew, cutting off the captain's head, legs, and arms. The sheer ferocity of such confrontations makes it clear that some of the men and women who battled in the coastal waters anticipated the violent future ominously, as when in 1735, the captives on the English ship Dolphin overpowered the crew, broke into the powder room, and finally, in the course of their effort for freedom, blew up both themselves and the crew. In February 1759, in the Gambia River, a battle on board a New England ship produced a similar outcome. When the vessel had taken on its captives, it was attacked by other Africans from the shore. I want to say that again. When the vessel had taken on its captives, it was attacked by other Africans from the shore. That they weren't even the ones on the ship, but saw their conditions connected to the folk on the ship. And they attacked the ship from the shore. According to a contemporary white account, the crew made a good defense, but the captain, finding himself desperately wounded and likely to be overcome, rather than fall into the hands, this is a quote, of such merciless wretches, when about 80 Negroes had boarded his vessel, discharged a pistol into his magazine and blew her up. Himself and every living soul on board perished. That this struggle for freedom, it started on the continent of Africa, continued on the ships, and continued even more in the New World. And I wanted to take some time today to hone in on some of the struggles that took place, because if you look at some maps of the slave trade, when they're trying to get a handle on how many sheer numbers of Africans that were moved off of the continent of Africa into the New World, along the Americas and down into Central and South America as well, as they begin to look at the sheer numbers, you'll see some maps when they're running out the routes of ships going from Africa to the Americas. Some ships some of those that are more detailed, you'll see a small number, a line. So they have lines that are thick based on the number of slaves or Africans that were transported. So if you go into Central and South America, those lines would be bigger than the one that came to America, because out of that 10 to 12 million estimated, about a little more than 500,000 of those ended up in what we know now as the New World. So that line that goes into the New World would be smaller than, say, the 2.7 million that went to certain areas in Central and South America. That line would be thicker. Well, when you look at some maps that are more detailed about where slave traffic went, some of them will show a small line that made a U-turn and went back to the continent of Africa. And that is to document those slave ships that were overpowered, and they turned the vessel around and went back to their continent and went back to their homes. Not a lot of them in comparison to the numbers that made the voyage across, but significant enough that when some people who are categorizing or cataloging the ships have documented that not all of them made their voyage across. Some of them made U-turns and came back to the continent of Africa. So as I prepare to close this one for today, I'll end with this last piece from Vincent Harding. He says, in spite of the constant danger of such suicidal white defense, Black men and women continued to resist. Still, there was always captains and other white men who claimed to be surprised at such persistent struggle. On another occasion, a group of Africans fresh from the Gold Coast attempted an uprising while the ship of a familiar captain, Snellgrave, was still near the shore. The 50 white men in the slavers' crew were healthy and well armed. Black resistance had not been expected. When the revolt had been crushed, Snellgrave had his translators ask what had induced them to mutiny. According to his own account, the Africans told him that he was, quote, a great rogue to buy them in order to carry them away from their own country, and that they were resolved to regain their liberty if possible. Snellgrave documents that that's what the Africans told him. They called him a great rogue for what he was doing. You are a great rogue to buy us in order to carry us away from our own country, and that we were resolved to regain our liberty if possible. And I want to say something about this as I close this with this. As I always say, I want to teach lessons in African-American history to give us lessons. And the lesson that I want to leave with us today is that in the spirit of this same struggle, let us not stop fighting now. Let us continue to honor the fight of those who fought before us, to make sure that every single one of us has every opportunity afforded to us. I'm going to talk a little bit later, as we're dealing with the slave trade, about the economic impacts of slavery in this country. And then we will broach the conversation in more detail on reparations. And I'm going to ask that question. And then in light of the things that you'll hear when we get to that place, when we begin to do those lessons, I will ask that question, knowing what you will know at that point. I'll pose the question again about reparations, because I believe that in light of all that was done and all that was made in light of what was done, that the country has a debt to be paid. And much like Dr. King, he wasn't talking about reparations when he said it, but what he said was that in the documents of this country, when he was given the March on Washington speech, He said in the founding documents of this country, he said it was like a check. He said, and we're coming to Washington to cash the check. He said, I'm certain that that check will not be returned in sufficient funds. And so the challenge for us is to examine our history and to look at the impacts of the things that have been done, and then approach them not from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength. That we're not simply asking, we're demanding because we have the right to. I think I said this on last week. People were paid for voluntarily smoking tobacco when African people involuntarily worked tobacco plantations. And if a person could be compensated for voluntarily smoking a tobacco product, then why in the world should the people and the ancestors of those who involuntarily were made to work those tobacco plantations not do any compensation for all of the money that has been made in those companies that are still billion-dollar industries today? I was looking up something, doing some work, and when the Japanese were put in internment camps during World War II, in 1988, a commission was put together, and ancestors of those individuals who were put in internment camps during the 1940s, 40 years later, this organization was formed for the purpose of compensating those ancestors for being placed in internment camps during the 1940s. And for those individuals who were documented ancestors were all given $20,000 in reparation payments for what happened to their ancestors. And I can go on with many more stories of individuals who things that happened to and have been compensated for what has happened to them. But as we look at what's going on, I'd make the argument even wider that America is not the only country that owes reparations to African Americans and African people. But just about most European countries that were party to this traffic have a check to write as well. But I believe when we know our history and we understand the impacts of what is being done, as I said, and I'll say this and I'll close it with this, because I want to always say this, I don't teach these classes for you to leave here and look at your white brothers and sisters sideways when you get to work tomorrow. What I will challenge you to do is to focus more on what our ancestors did. And later on, I'm going to show you what God did, because I got to put my pastor hat on in certain parts of this too. And I'm going to spend some time showing you things that God did in the midst of all of it. But I challenge us to learn as much as we can about what we've been through and what our ancestors have been through. And then develop strategies and plans, because the other lesson is this. Our ancestors on these ships fighting for their freedom were developing strategies and plans. Strategies and plans of how they would work through taking over ships and going back home. Strategies and plans on how they would figure out how to get as much out of whatever the conditions they were in. They didn't just simply accept their fate. They were looking for what the best they could get out of the worst situations that they found themselves in. And in the same spirit of that, we've got to develop strategies and plans, just like they developed strategies and plans. Many of them fought, ships were taken over, but they died, and the plan outlived them. And we have to learn how to develop plans that will, well, I'll take this back. We have to relearn, because we knew how to do it and we know how to do it. And our ancestors did it. It's why we're here. They developed plans that would outlive them. We've got to continue to develop plans that will outlive us to ensure that our children's children, yet unborn, will be born into a better situation than we were born into. That if we look at our lives right now, as crazy as things are in the world that we live in today, we have to be honest to admit that our ancestors and in the work that they did allowed us to be born into a better situation. It's not perfect. It can always be better, but it is absolutely better than the periods that our ancestors had to fight through. And we now have to receive the mantle that they have given to us to ensure that our children yet unborn will be born into a better situation as well. Some of you all have heard me say this, but I'm gonna say it in this group, that we have to live with a determination that none of the things that our ancestors have fought for will we allow anybody to take it back. We've got to fight to ensure that the fight and the work that they did, we don't allow anybody to undo that work. As a matter of fact, there's still more work to be done. No, we're not giving it back. You still have more to do. We're not giving back what you've already given. You have more to give because the debt is still not paid. The work is still yet to be done. And I'm challenging us as we go through this class to look at the work and the fight of our ancestors and tap into that same fight and make the commitment that nothing that they fought for will we allow anybody to take it back. So I'm going to close right there. I'm going to do something a little bit different. Well, I'm going to do it this time. This is what I'll do because I won't let it. I want to be off the cuff. Here's what I want us to do. If you have any questions, this will eventually end up it's on Facebook Live right now on the Lessons in African American History page. It will be on the YouTube page here within about another week. Both last week's lesson and this one will be up here shortly. But I want you, if you have any questions, if you're watching this on Facebook Live or in YouTube, I encourage you to put questions there. I also encourage you, if you have access to me, to ask them directly, because what I want to do is that there are going to be times when some of these lessons, I want them to directly address any questions that you might have. So I encourage you inside of any one of those platforms, inside of this room, if you type it, it'll be in the chat, or you can direct message me in some way, because sometimes I want these classes to simply be opportunities for people to ask questions, and I can address those questions as well. Some of them may require me to do a little research, but I will come back and give you the answers that you seek. But I'm so excited and thankful for those who were able to make it this evening. And my hope is that something was said today that tapped into something inside of you as we were tapping into the resistance of our ancestors. I wanted to spend some time to talk about this in a little bit more detail, because I want to make the point that our ancestors did not simply accept their fate. And there's so much conversation about that I'm so concerned that people will begin to write a history that waters down or leaves out so many things. I'll tell you, there are books out there now that are calling the slave trade immigration. Just like any other immigrant coming into the country, there are books out there now that are calling the slave trade immigration. And so I want to challenge us to know our history and not allow any individuals to teach that history in a way that does not give us the ability to truly see and understand the work that our ancestors have done.